Okay, so we're now brilliant. So we've now started recording. So fantastic. So welcome to everybody, and especially to Gregory. So this is the second in our mini series of talks around death, religion, and culture. We've got one coming up next week, which is to do with healthcare and death. And hopefully we'll be running another short mini series later on in the year. It's just trying to sort a few bits out. So I'm going to hand over to Gregory, who will introduce you himself because he'll do a far better job of it than I will. And I'm going to mute and turn off my camera and then completely over to you, Gregory. So thank you very much for doing this.
Thanks for inviting me, Tina. It's great. So yeah, my name is Gregory Shushan. I'm a historian of religions with a kind of unconventional academic background. I started out in first Eastern Mediterranean archaeology, and then kind of went over to Egyptian archaeology specifically, and then defected over to religious studies, where I kind of stayed in that general area. But I kind of consider myself more of a historian of religions rather than a regular religious studies person, because that sort of implies that contemporary religions, still living religions, where I don't really deal with the living very much. So I should also mention you might hear a hysterical dog suddenly barking in the background, because I have a dog sitting over here staring out the window, and occasionally if he sees another dog go by, then he kind of loses it. So just ignore that. I may have to jump up and get him to be quiet. So just to be aware. So I'll start with the kind of most basic thing, which is what is a near-death experience. This term has kind of entered into the common collective consciousness, but in various ways. Some people just think it's like, I nearly died. So they'll say things like, oh my God, I had a near-death experience. I tripped as I was walking down the street and a bus almost hit me. And you're waiting for the rest of the story, and it never comes. And the rest of the story, technically what a near-death experience refers to, is when you're either clinically temporarily dead, you've lost consciousness, and been declared dead or perceived as dead within your own community. And then you revive and you report that you had these various experiences while you were ostensibly dead. So yeah, basically a spontaneous, evidently universal occurrence in which your consciousness apparently leaves the body during a period of clinical death or near death and has these so-called spiritual types of episodes. Some examples of those, the most kind of commonly reported ones around the world, are out-of-body experience. So the feeling of sensation of actually separating from your body, hovering above it. A lot of people report actually seeing their body lying there below them, seeing their dead body, and then they ascend through darkness, which is sometimes described as a tunnel. Then they emerge into bright light, and sometimes they meet a being of light, some kind of a benevolent presence, which they might identify as a deity, sometimes not. And that identification of the deity is related to the person's culture. So the Christian will come back and say, I saw Jesus, and a Buddhist will come back and say, I saw the Buddha, and so on. Meeting deceased relatives is also really common. And then sometimes that being of light will assist in a sort of evaluation of the life that you just left, your good and bad deeds. In Western NDEs, there's a kind of stereotype that this is a panoramic life review where you experience your entire span of your life all in one moment. And along with that, you experience the emotions of people that you've interacted with throughout your life. So if you treated somebody poorly, then you're going to feel the feelings that you caused in that person to feel in such according to your actions. That's a very Western kind of stereotype. We'll get into the cross-cultural differences pretty soon, though. You also hear a lot of reports of people going to other realms. There's sometimes these idealized images of Earth, so beautiful plains and fields of flowers and things like that. Then there's an obstacle or some kind of barrier, some kind of boundary that the person can't cross. at a certain point. And sometimes they're sent back by this being of light or by one of their relatives or somebody who says, it's not your time to die. There are also feelings of transcendence with the divine or some kind of feeling of oneness, universal oneness. And then after returning, there are these positive after effects. So people report being less materialistic, more charitable, more tolerant, and sometimes, occasionally, they'll have some kind of claim to have some kind of clairvoyant or precognitive or other supernatural powers, healing powers, or something along these lines. So near-death experiences were only sort of discovered in the West in 1975 by a psychologist named Raymond Moody. And while he sort of mentioned the existence of cross-cultural examples, they didn't really come into play in the field for almost 50 years, really, and still to a large degree they're really neglected. Most of the time when you hear about near-death experiences, what they're referring to is Western near-death experiences in usually Anglophone countries or Europe. There have been a few studies kind of trickling out over the decades of specific NDEs that somebody found in Israel, Hawaii, or whatever, and that's helped a lot. But it's been really lagging as far as recognizing that this is, for one thing, not only a cross-cultural sort of phenomena, but also that we need to look at the cross-cultural differences in order to understand the experience as a whole, basically. The kind of approach from near-death studies has been to identify a kind of construct, really, more than identify, a typology of near-death experiences, which they can claim is the same around the world. And this is usually, most of the near-death studies people have been psychologists, cardiologists, psychiatrists, all kind of medical science people for the most part. Very few sociologists. There have been a couple of exceptions, prominent ones like James McLennan and Alan Kelleher, a couple of religious studies people or theologians. Carol Zaleski did a book on medieval NDEs. But for the most part, there hasn't been that many historians, certainly no ancient historians that I know of. But for the most part, these scholars were trying to determine if there was this universal prototype of an NDE that everybody around the world was having. And so we could say, these are all the same. And there have been two agendas behind that from different sides of the aisle. On the one side, the argument can be, they're all the same, therefore that proves that it's all in the brain and that they're just evidence of the dying brain creating these kind of special effects. And then there are people who want to say they're all the same and that proves that there's a heaven and that there's a God. But the problem here is that they're not all the same. And after 50 years of trying to find this, ideal typology that all NDEs are the same, it just hasn't been possible. There are a lot of speculations about why that might be the case. For example, whether the person was genuinely dead, temporarily dead or not, how long they were dead, their state of mind at the time, which really shouldn't be a huge factor if it's a biological creation. But these are all kind of different factors that come into play when talking about cross-cultural NDEs. So now, after kind of years of study, I've been doing this for 23, 24 years. And now we know about NDEs from pretty much everywhere in the world, almost every cultural area, including all of these listed here. So in the kind of quest to find this ideal stereotypical NDE, the similarities and differences have been kind of the differences have been really ignored and the similarities have been kind of exaggerated. So for example, in some societies, I mentioned that the person having the ND reaches this point of return, basically, where they're told to go back. The Western stereotype is that you need to go back because you need to care for your loved ones, you have to look after your child, you have to finish your PhD, you have to do some kind of fulfill something that would be a kind of rather individualistic self-improvement kind of thing. Or on the other hand, a kind of charitable thing. You have to go and help society, tell people about what you experienced, and change the spiritual consciousness of your community, that kind of thing. But in some small scale societies, in Asian NDEs and other parts of the world, the reason for return is more often a case of mistaken identities. So they would, the being of light or the relative would say, there's been an error in the bookkeeping. We got the wrong Gregory Shushan. We wanted the one who lives in this little village in Persia somewhere. So we're going to get him. You go back to your body. So I would, wake up in my body and tell about this NDE, and the poor unsuspecting other Gregory Shushan in Persia would then die for good and go to the other world. So we have the similarity that you're being told to return. You're being sent back to your body. And because if you didn't, you wouldn't have had an NDE, you would just be dead. So we have that inciting reason for a return and the return itself, but those reasons are very different. And then another one that's varies a lot cross-culturally. The Western stereotype is rushing through a tunnel. We even have this expression, the light at the end of the tunnel. And whenever you see films about NDEs, that's one of the most kind of typical signals that, okay, that's an NDE happening. You see the tunnel spiraling. That's actually a very Western phenomenon. In other cultures, they describe moving through darkness or maybe going through a cave. Sometimes it's not even darkness at all. In a lot of Native American societies, they just talk about walking along a path to the other world. And that's also in Polynesia. It seems to be a small scale society uniqueness. They'll even say, I saw the footprints in the sand of the deceased people who went to the other world before me. So again, we have traveling to the other world is the kind of thematic element, but the way they get to the other world is walking along a path, along the path to the ghost village, or however they describe it, rather than rushing through a tunnel to this sort of heavenly other world. So these similarities and differences are obviously very important for the arguments I mentioned, whether it's a materialist argument saying that NDEs are just special effects of a dying brain, or whether you're saying this is a metaphysical reality, that this is their evidence of an actual life after death. One of the reasons for this is in materialist science, there's been a study not long ago, last year, where they identified that when rats die, there's a burst of chemical activity in their brains, and researchers, and then this was actually applied to a human. They actually, for the first time, registered the dying brain of a person with an EEG and got the readings at the moment of death. I was surprised that this had not been done plenty of times before, but apparently not. And they found the same thing, that there's this massive burst of electrical activity in the brain right at the moment of death. So the scientists interpreted this along with the parallel with the rats, saying this is proof that NDEs are all in the brain. This burst of activity can account for the kind of experiences that NDEers have. And they even pinpointed the life review. They said, with all this massive activity, it's like the floodgates of the consciousness barriers of the brain coming down, and suddenly you experience everything at once, and that accounts for the life review. But as I mentioned earlier, the life review is a very Western specific kind of phenomenon. So in that particular sense, the differences actually challenge the materialist interpretations of NDEs. But having said all that, that's kind of not really my main area of study anyway, whether they're true or not. My focus is really on the ways in which NDEs are kind of processed within a culture, whether they're valorized or whether they're excluded or denied or whatever. So this kind of allows us to understand the religious dimensions of NDEs and the way that they've been received traditionally in different societies. One of the most interesting dimensions of that for me is what's called the experiential source hypothesis. Sorry, let me just, yeah, that was just to illustrate the different cultures in which NDEs occur, different ways they're found. So the experiential source hypothesis, this is the idea that supernatural beliefs originate in extraordinary experiences, such as near-death experiences. The term itself was coined by David Hufford, and he kind of came up with this in relation to a phenomenon called sleep paralysis. This is where when you're in a hypnagogic state, they call it, a state between waking and sleeping. It can happen whether you're falling asleep or just before waking up. Some people report feeling a massive weight on their chest. They feel paralyzed with fear. They can't call out, they can't speak. And the thing that's holding a weight on their chest is identified differently in different cultures. So in some places it's seen as an old witch, and some places it's a ghost or whatever. In Western accounts, they often say that this is probably where alien abduction ideas come from. So the idea is that this experience, which Hufford actually isolated as a physiological thing, there's not really any debate about the origins of sleep paralysis, is a universal occurrence, but people overlay their cultural interpretations on it. But still, the experience itself is preceding the belief. So that's the how he kind of got into the phrase the experiential source hypothesis. But it was also argued by various scholars in the past, going all the way back to Andrew Lang in the 19th century and James Mooney and various others. The Swedish anthropologist Ake Hultkrantz found it to be especially prevalent in Native American societies. And he even actually found a distinction between their descriptions of dreams, shamanic visions, vision quest types of visions, and near-death experiences. Obviously, they didn't have the term near-death experience, and either did Hultkrantz, because he was writing in the 50s, but it was very much the context of a death and return as opposed to a deliberately induced type of vision. And most importantly, he found that they valued those types of experience as real forms of knowledge much more than they valued shamanic or visionary types of experiences. So it's not clearly a matter of people having an experience and then kind of overlaying a cultural interpretation on it. It's more like the experience and the cultural preconceptions are intertwined. You can't have the experience without your cultural symbolism being overlaid on it, because then what would you even be experiencing? There's this idea of the experience of pure consciousness, but an NDE has these very specific types of sub-experiences. So it's not an experience of pure consciousness when you're experiencing these apparently external things, like a being of light or ancestors or rushing through darkness. So our brains or our minds or consciousness needs a way of understanding them, so we use our cultural symbols. But even this is not necessarily a metaphysical argument. There's a materialist philosopher named Thomas Metzinger, and he was talking about out-of-body experiences. He thinks that they're entirely a product of the workings of the brain. But he also said for anybody who actually had that type of experience, it's almost impossible not to become an ontological dualist afterwards. Almost inevitably, out-of-body experiences lead the experiencing subject to the conclusion that consciousness can, as a matter of fact, take place independently of the brain and of the body. So what that means is really that an apparently metaphysical experience, which Metzinger does not think is genuinely metaphysical, nevertheless leads to a metaphysical belief, just like sleep paralysis. So how this relates all to the ancient world and my research is my first study. I was doing Egyptian archaeology, as I mentioned, and we were reading these afterlife books like the Book of the Dead, and in my case, more specifically, the pyramid texts and the coffin texts, which are quite a bit earlier. And I just started noticing these kind of familiar, very thematic elements. So within all the references to Osiris and Re and the sun bark that sails through the heavens and down through the underworld, and all these very specific cultural things, there was leaving the body, entering darkness, coming out into a realm of light, encountering a being of light, meeting deceased relatives, all these very familiar near-death experience types of tropes, if you will. And I knew about near-death experiences already, and I was familiar with Carol Zaleski's book that I mentioned about medieval NDEs, and I just started wondering how, if this could also be applied to ancient Egypt. So I should hasten to add that there are no accounts of near-death experiences from ancient Egypt. There was no kind of literary genre or writing was not put to those kinds of uses, personal narratives about personal experiences. It was all documentary or priestly religious texts and things like that. So there was no way for somebody, no context for someone to express them if they even did have them. So I was kind of comparing phenomenologically what the afterlife beliefs in different cultures were like in order to see if they had these sort of core features of an NDE manifested within them. And I found that they did. And so I looked at Egypt, Mesopotamia, especially Sumerian and Akkadian, Aztec and Maya, pre-Buddhist China, and Vedic India, sort of before what we call Hinduism was in India, Hinduism proper. So in all of those societies, I found sort of 9 or so of those key elements of NDEs that we went through before. But I also found a few examples of what may have been actual NDEs. The earliest, you've probably heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Sumerian version of Gilgamesh, he was named Bilgamesh. And his story may be the contender for the world's earliest documentary NDE, because he's believed to have been an actual, real historical king. Probably somewhere around 1800 or maybe as early as 2000 BCE. And the text tells how he traveled to the other world while his body was lying on his deathbed. He was told by a voice not to enter the underworld with an angry heart. And then he was encountered by a group of deities who were radiating light, and they reviewed his good deeds in order to determine what his fate should be after that. There was then a funerary banquet in the other world held in his honor, and he was greeted by his deceased relatives, along with various kings and governors and military commanders who he had known in his life on Earth. So the experience was transformative, because after his heart was undone by the being of light, as the text put it, the being of light being Utu, who is the sun god in ancient Sumerian religion, he was then transformed into a demigod himself. And he even became a ruler and a judge in the netherworld. Then finally, he returned to his body and he woke up. The text stresses that his case was exceptional and that this doesn't happen to everybody, which might reflect the reality of near-death experiences. They don't happen to everybody, and especially in a community where advanced medical resuscitation techniques were unknown. Another possible early actual NDE might be from the Upanishads in India from around the 5th century BCE. There's a story of a small boy named Nachikitas, who one day he saw his father was giving away all of his possessions, and that confused the boy, and he kept asking him, why are you giving away your stuff? And then he said, who are you going to give me to? Thinking that he was going to be next among his father's possessions to be given away. And his father just kind of ignored him and kept carrying on. And the boy was pestering and saying, who will you give me to? And finally, the father got annoyed and he said, I'll give you to death, which effectively means, within the context of this story, that he kills the boy. So Nachikitas goes to the underworld and he finds himself alone. The god of the underworld, Yama, is nowhere to be seen. And so he's left unattended without food for 3 days. And then finally Yama appears, and he's abashed at his lapse in hospitality, and he's apologetic. So he grants Nachikitas 3 wishes. The boy's first wish is that his father will be kind to him, and that when he returns, he'll be greeted with joyfulness rather than anger from his father. His second wish is that he wants the secrets of the fire altar ritual to be revealed because he knows that that ritual leads to heaven. He describes heaven as a place that transcends fear and sorrow and hunger and thirst, and it's a place of immortality and joyfulness. Yama agrees to those wishes, and he gives the boy what he calls a glittering disc of gold, which is supposed to help him to attain a positive afterlife. But then for his third wish, Nachikitas asks to understand the mysteries of the afterlife itself. But here, Yama is reluctant to give this information, to grant this wish. And he tries to put the boy off by saying, it's hard to understand. You wouldn't get it. It's a subtle doctrine, and, you should really make another wish. But the boy, being a young kid, he pesters and kind of wheedles and convinces Yama to grant that wish after all. And eventually Yama gives in, and he reveals the importance of the word Om, which is the sort of transcendent sound representing all of divinity and the universe, the oneness of the divine in the afterlife. So the fact that Nachikitas chooses knowledge for two of his wishes reinforces that connection between the afterlife being this realm of transformation and a realm of ultimate wisdom and knowledge. And then there's a really interesting one from ancient China around the same time, actually. There's an account of a provincial ruler named Jianzi. He was sick and about to die, and he was in a coma for almost 3 days. Then he woke up and he claimed to have been enjoying himself at the home of the Emperor of Heaven. He wandered there with various gods or spirits who kind of accompanied him there. And he heard music and saw dancing, and he found this all a very moving kind of experience that affected him quite deeply. But then he said, while he was there in the other world, he was attacked by a bear. And at that point, the Emperor of Heaven told him, shoot that bear before it has a chance to maul us, to kill us. So he did that, and then a spotted bear came and he killed that one too. And the emperor was so impressed that he gave Jianzi 2 baskets, each containing a set of things, which unfortunately you don't tell us what those things are. And he also assigned to him a particular dog as to give to one of his sons when he gets back. And he gave him some various kinds of political prophecies. All these kind of elements are intended to later demonstrate that this narrative was actually true. So before returning to Earth, Jianzi sees at the emperor's side a small boy who's standing there. And this particular incident, which is made very clear in the text, they make a point of pointing this out, leads to a kind of evidential proof of this being an actual near-death experience. Because years later, Jianzi was walking down a street and he encounters a mysterious man who's just standing there in the pathway and he won't move. And he suddenly realizes he recognizes him from somewhere but can't quite place him. And the man explains that while he was ill, he was the child standing there at the side of the emperor, and he confirmed all the details of the near-death experience. He said, I saw you kill the first bear, I saw you kill the second bear. I heard the prophecies, and those prophecies are now coming true. So all these things were seen as proof of the near-death experience, and as well as validating the afterlife beliefs that were already in place in ancient China at that time. It's also possibly the first example of what's called in near-death studies a peak Indarian experience, which is a kind of odd, unfortunate phrase that has stuck. It comes from a Keats poem, but it essentially means meeting somebody in the other world who you didn't know had already died. There are quite a few examples of this throughout the literature, throughout history, and quite a few in contemporary accounts as well. Somebody will die and then they'll come back to life and they'll say, I met my Uncle John there, and then they'll be told, your Uncle John died yesterday. So to me, that's one of the most kind of almost chilling evidential things about near-death experiences, because it's not replicable in any kind of scientific laboratory way, but it's also to me totally unexplainable how a person could know that somebody else just died after claiming that they'd seen them in the other world while they were themselves unconscious to the point of being declared clinically dead, or at least perceived that way. There's also a really interesting example from ancient Mesoamerica. This goes back to the 15th century CE, so we're talking, almost 2,000 years after the Chinese and Indian ones, way on the other side of the world. And I should mention, by the way, none of these cultures had any kind of cultural interaction with them. I mean, Egypt and Sumer did, China and India a bit, but for the most part, I kind of isolated the eras I was looking at them to times when they didn't have a lot of cultural interaction. So there was this Mexican princess who it's believed she was a real person, named Quetzalcoatl, and her account is preserved in a text by the Spanish missionary and ethnographer named Bernardino de Sahagún. He recounts a story in which she fell ill and then she died after being assaulted by her father-in-law, Moquihuish, who was a ruler of the Tlatelolco city-state in Mexico. So she's lying there dead and her cremation was prepared. But then one of her family members, they don't explain why, but she obviously had some kind of premonition, insisted that she wouldn't be cremated and that instead they should prepare a burial for her. So they did that and they prepared her burial, and the text stresses she did indeed die. They make a point of saying there was no question about that. And they explain how her corpse was prepared. They describe the digging of the grave, how the earth was packed down on it, how the stones were piled on top. So after 4 days of her lying in her grave, she was greeted by a sickly and deformed youth who told her that she should sing despite all of her sufferings. Look on the bright side, even though you're dead and in your grave. So he guided her soul across some grassy plains to the realm of Tlalocan, which is the paradise of the dead, sacred to the god Tlaloc, who's like a god of spring and renewal and fertility. She meets the god, she meets Tlaloc there, who asked her if she had come to stay forever. And the guide who was with her explained to Tlaloc that no, she was only there to observe and to meet the god, to have this encounter with the divine. So Tlaloc shows her that the priests on earth are dancing for her in her honor. We're not really sure if that was in a sort of shamanic attempt to try to bring her soul back, like maybe they weren't totally convinced she was dead, or if it was a funerary ritual. The text isn't clear on that, but both I think are possible. And then she meets the soul of her own stepson who had died a few years earlier. And then Tlaloc explains to her that this little boy will be reborn on earth and he'll grow up to become an educated person, adult. So in his next life, he'll be fulfilled as a person rather than having to die in childhood, which is interesting because it's also, evidence of reincarnation at this early pre-Christian traditions. So then he gives Quetzalcoatl a small vessel, very similar to the ancient Chinese account of Jianzi. And he tells her to take this vessel back to earth with her, and it contains a healing substance which she can use to cure her people of disease. She was also showed the place where the spirits of leaders and rulers lived, and she saw the famous Aztec emperor Moctezuma I, who had also died a few years earlier. Unfortunately, the next page of that text is actually missing, so we don't have the story of her return or going back to her body or what she did with that healing vessel or anything else. But there's a related account which might be based on it. It's not really clear. That comes from a neighboring city-state of Tenochtitlan, which is modern Mexico City. That experience is also of a woman who died and came back to life and had, it's a little more dramatic. They describe how the stones lying on top of her coffin went flying in all directions as she burst out of the earth to claim that she was alive and had been to the other world. This woman went to see the king Moctezuma II, and she told him what she'd seen. And she said the reason that she had come back to life was to inform him that his reign would soon come to an end and that the city would soon be conquered by they who come, which is apparently a cryptic prophecy about the Spaniards coming to conquer the land. So in addition to just their very existence and the fact that we have these pretty clear examples of near-death experiences presented by the indigenous people in a factual context, they're not saying this is our belief, they're saying this is what happened. What also makes these accounts really interesting is the way they were later combined and reworked and manipulated by Spanish Catholic missionaries as basically colonialist propaganda to sanction the conquest. So there was a version related by Juan de Torquemada, and this one, the woman is recast as a sister of Moctezuma II, and he calls her Papan, and instead of the unnamed woman that of Tenochtitlan that the earlier text didn't even name. And so in this example, instead of a sickly, deformed youth coming to greet her, she's now met by a shining winged angel who has a cross on his head. He takes her on another world journey, which is very similar to the medieval examples of monks and nuns who have these other world journeys in Karol Zaleski's book, and which you can find in the dialogues of Gregory the Great and all kinds of other texts. And then the prophecy that she learns during her near-death experience is no longer a warning that the Spaniards are going to come and conquer us. It's now that she comes back to become the leader in baptizing her people into the new faith. And then still later in the 18th century, in a version by Francisco Javier de Claviero, he is renamed Papan, now Papanzin, and she has now become, the way it's quoted in the text, a perfect model of Christian virtues. And she brought back from her NDE the news of the true God, the creator of heaven, and she was seen as the first indigenous person to be baptized. So you can see how gradually stripped of all of its indigenous cultural elements, the story was actually used to legitimize the conquest. And this particular version, this 18th century version, was even sanctioned by the Vatican as being historical truth, even though of all the versions, it's the least likely to have been historical truth. So this really attests to the political force of near-death experiences, the potential political force at least, which is really more along the lines of what I looked at in my second book, which was really focused on near-death experience in indigenous religions, especially in Africa, Native Americans, and Oceania, specifically Polynesia, Melanesia, Australia, and New Zealand, and Micronesia. So the idea here was, again, different parts of the world that didn't have much contact with each other, or in this case, really any contact with each other in the eras I was looking at. I tried to isolate them to times when, before any kind of Christian influence, before missionaries really got a hold. But of course, the sources are written mostly by missionaries or explorers or early ethnographers. So they're not exactly totally unbiased. But the consistency of them, not only within each area, but across the three different eras, is pretty convincing that these, for the most part, are genuinely real accounts, because there's also not really any kind of propaganda reason to be inventing near-death experiences and imposing them on all these people around the world. It's not even a part of Christianity, really. So what I found, just in a very general sense, was that Native American cultures tended to valorize near-death experiences. I found something like 70 examples of NDEs, either specific accounts or people talking about them and saying, yeah, we know all about this phenomenon, and in fact, we know about the afterlife because so-and-so died and went to the other world and came back and told us. So this is an indigenous validation of the experiential source hypothesis. There's no speculation here. The only refutation of that would be to basically call all of these indigenous cultures liars, and to say that they didn't know what they were talking about, or some other kind of ethnocentric denial of indigenous truth, which is unfortunately sometimes done. But I think it can be taken as factual that the experiential source hypothesis applies to these cultures when they say they do. The case was very similar in Polynesia. I think it was 36 cases, 19 of which claimed that they knew about the afterlife through near-death experiences. And also in Melanesia, there were quite a lot. The difference, the exceptions that prove the rule really were Micronesia, Australia, and Africa, where there were very, very, very few examples of near-death experiences. And I think this had to do with a different cultural context in which the NDEs were occurring. So for example, in Melanesia and Polynesia, to an extent, they were very much open to any kind of supernatural phenomena involving the afterlife. So there was mediumship and shamanism and communication with the dead. And in Native America, there was shamanism and vision quests where they would deliberately seek different kinds of visions. So they were open to these kinds of things. There's also a lot of reincarnation beliefs, whereas in a lot of African societies, a lot of Micronesian and Australian societies, they're more focused. Their shamanism was more focused on possession and healing, and healing without recourse to the other world. And there were also beliefs in the ancestors kind of remaining on Earth, local to the village. So the idea of an individual having an experience where they died and went off to some other place where ancestors live in another world was not really culturally relevant. And then with the possession beliefs kind of overlaid on top of that, NDEs were often viewed with suspicion. So especially from quite a few African examples, there are stories of people who came back to life and would be stoned to death, or they would say, I went to the other world and was told that I wasn't presentable because I was sacrificed while I was naked, and I was told I need to get dressed and then come back to the other world. And so that would then happen. The person would get dressed and then say, okay, I'm ready, and they'd be clubbed to death and sent back to the other world. There are also very different attitudes towards death and burial. So there wasn't this attempts at resuscitation at all costs. If somebody thought they were dying, they would just kind of accept it and wander off into the forest to die. So there were, for one thing, fewer attempts, fewer possibilities of a person having a near-death experience just physically because of lack of resuscitation, and then fewer attempts for them to be able to voice them in a way that was safe, essentially. And this is actually a pattern that that's evident in relatively recent times. There was an NDE from the Congo in the work of James McLennan. I think it was from the 80s. Somebody woke up from their coma state, from their near-death state, and their loved ones who were gathered around the bed, crying and mourning, they all fled. They were afraid that he was basically a possessed spirit, that they didn't think he was himself come back to life. And that took some explaining for them to actually understand it. And when they did, they were of course happy to have their relative back. But the the possession belief is very powerful. There's an interesting account from Hawaii, which is has a lot of really interesting kind of typical near-death experience elements. It's almost a model example. It's a woman named Kalima who was reported to have died sometime before 1892. She had an illness and her body was prepared for burial. They dug her grave. The mourners had gathered. So again, locally, she was not there was no question about her being dead or not. She was taken for dead. But then she suddenly revived. She opened her eyes. And again, her family were afraid at first, and it took some convincing for them to accept her back into the community. But once they were very happy. And she said, "I have something very strange to tell you." It's interesting because this is one of the earliest verbatim accounts we have, where it's actually in the first person of the speech of the person who had the NDE. She said, I seem to leave my body and stand beside it, looking down on what was me. The me that was standing there looked like the form I was looking at, only I was alive and the other was dead," which is a really interesting description, I think, of like the idea of a subtle body, or that you have this sort of quasi-physical spiritual form in the other world, where it has appearance that kind of mimics your body, but it's not a physical body. So Kalima left her village, and she was walked along a path to the other world until she reached a village of spirits. She said there were hundreds and hundreds of souls of the dead. She recognized some of them, but at this point she still didn't even realize that she was dead. And she found it strange because all the people she kept seeing were people she had seen in life who were dead. And this recognition of dead people is one of the things that led her to realize, oh, I must be dead too. And that's a feature that comes up quite a lot in near-death experiences around the world as well. She said everybody was full of laughter and joy, and she was really happy to be there. She said, my heart sang within me, and I was glad to be dead. And then she continued on to a volcano known as Pele's Pit. Pele is the creator goddess. And she met spirits there who told her, you must go back to your body. It's not yet your time to die. But she said, I didn't want to go back. I begged and prayed to be allowed to stay with them. But they said, no, you must go back. And if you don't go willingly, we're going to make you. And so they did. She's crying and protesting. And they literally chased her back. All these spirits who were originally very happy to see her and welcoming and full of joy basically turned on her and chased her back to her body. When she got there, she looked at it and she said, was that my body? What a horrid, loathsome thing it was to me now, since I had seen so many beautiful, happy creatures in the other world. Must I go into that thing and live in it again? No, I would not go into it. I rebelled and I cried out for mercy. So this is another thing that you come across a lot in NDEs, including a lot of contemporary ones. People say they see this cold, dead husk of a thing lying there, and they don't even relate it to them, to their individuality. They don't see it as part of themselves. Their real self is now the thing that's floating above, and they don't want to get back into that thing. But the spirits forced her in a very, just as you start thinking, okay, this is a very cross-culturally universal type example, they force her in through her big toe. That's not something that you come across in any Western NDE, to my knowledge. So then her body comes to life again. She opens her eyes and she says, I wish I had stayed with those happy people. It was cruel to make me come back. My other body was so beautiful and I was so happy. And apparently she never ceased to regret coming back to her body. I'll just give one more example from small scale societies. And that's of a Kiowa Native American prophet named Bianchi. It's unclear if his NDE was deliberately induced. It seems like it was like it was a shamanistic one where he traveled to the other world through a shamanic process. I've started referring to these as shamanic NDEs because they seem to be accessing the same type of reality or consciousness. He was actually inspired by the ghost dance religious movement, which itself was founded on the NDEs of its founders. And the ghost dance involved deliberately going into trance states, which were brought about by extremes of prolonged dancing, fasting, prayer, and sometimes hallucinogenics. So Bianchi undertook frequent visits to the spirit world in order to obtain knowledge and information for his people. But what makes his case so interesting is that he actually illustrated his NDEs. This is one particular one where he described where how it depicts that he traveled across a plain of buffalo until he reached this spirit village. You can see the teepees there in the background. And he met 4 women who he'd known in life. They're there on horseback to the right. They had sacks of wild plums. They told him where he could find his deceased brothers, and he went to greet them. And on the way to greet them, he met 2 curious beings, which he depicted as green triangular figures with crosses at their tops. You can see those in the middle. And then those are his brothers there on the left. They told him to continue, and then he came to a ghost dance circle, which was right in the middle of the page. And there he saw another woman that he had known on Earth. And then he went into the village and found the rest of his relatives, and eventually woke up on a mountainside where he'd gone into his trance. This is another drawing of his near-death experience. It's kind of unclear what exactly is going on. Unfortunately, he didn't tell us what that picture symbolizes, but I think with some kind of imaginative speculation, that the top part, it was originally in 3 different sections, 3 different pieces of paper that were glued together. The top part might be like a kind of tunnel type experience converging on those flashes of light in the middle. In the middle, it's kind of anyone's guess, but there's some figure in that circle. Maybe that's the ghost dance circle again. And then at the bottom, we have this kind of divine figure with a cross on its head and this rainbow type thing below. But what's interesting about this from the perspective of the experiential source hypothesis is that picture on the right is Bianchi himself holding that very picture, teaching his people about the afterlife. So he's teaching them about the afterlife based on his experience and using his drawing as an illustration. And I use that drawing, by the way, in the cover of my second book. It was the first time it had ever been published anywhere. So actually, I think I'm going to skip over the mediumship and reincarnation stuff for now. But very quickly, I'll just mention this Congolese prophet who I mentioned, the African perception on NDEs and possession. This is a prophet named Beatrice Kimpavita. She was a Catholic medium. So she was a Catholic as well as being a medium in a local healing cult. And she had an NDE which was brought about by a ritual death within that cult. They would essentially bring it about by cutting off the circulation, by tying their extremities with bonds, and then they would pass out. And upon revival, they would see this as a rebirth. And as far as we know, in some cases, maybe they did actually, lose consciousness to the point of temporary death. But when they revived, they were believed to be possessed by a friendly spirit who would then stay with them throughout their lives. Kimpavita, though, then had a natural illness and death and a near-death experience, and she died apparently during this long illness. And when she came back, she claimed that she had met Saint Anthony, and he told her, "I've been sent from God to your head to preach to the people." And he gave her these different kinds of political and religious prophecies and instructions. And then he entered her body, and he stayed with her in her body for the rest of her life, she claimed. So just as the spirits in the healing cult, which is a totally indigenous cult, stayed with the people in the community for the rest of their lives, she had Saint Anthony staying with her. So rather than the experience itself and meeting relatives and a being of light and the tunnel and all this information about the afterlife, none of that mattered, wasn't even recorded. What mattered was Saint Anthony possessing her. So again, we have this emphasis on possession in an African example, and it's very similar in that sense to the ghost dance, because after this it was replicated by various people within the cult community. They would kind of reenact her death and rebirth in order to kind of access that afterlife realm the way she did during her actual near-death experience. So Okay, I'm going to have 3 more minutes just because this is really interesting. Just very quickly, there's this problem with truth about near-death experiences. I mentioned these prophecies that were later validated. But this is another example of a validated prophecy. This Mormon pioneer named Walter Munson, who's a missionary actually, he died in a hospital in Utah in 1923. And as he described it after he woke up, he had passed into another sphere of life. He said he had left his body, had feelings of joy and freedom, transcended time and space, and then he saw his young daughter who had died 21 years earlier. He wanted to stay with her, but she told him, "You actually have to go back," because she put it in a strange way. She said, "I want Richard first," which was her little brother, Walter's other son, then grandmother, then mother, and then it will be your turn. So Walter Munson came back to life. Within a week, his son Richard died. His mother died about 2 months later. And then a few years later, his wife died. So all these deaths occurred in the exact order that was predicted by his daughter in the afterlife. But what's interesting about that is there are lots of prophecies that happen in NDEs that don't become fulfilled. There's a really interesting study by Kenneth Ring, an American NDE researcher, who found that lots and lots of near-death experiences were prophesying the end of the world, and followed by a rebirth and a golden age, a kind of millennial type prophecy. And the problem was that this was done in the 80s. They were all saying it was going to happen around 1988 or maybe 1992, all in that sort of era. And at the same time, there was a British scholar, researcher named Margot Gray. She found the exact same thing. They didn't even know about each other's studies. They even had the same dates coming up, which is a little mysterious. But both were making these same kinds of revelations, and obviously neither came to pass. So that raises questions about what the truth claims of near-death experiences and the kinds of prophecies that people receive in them. So I think I'm going to have to leave it there, and I'll have to skip over the reincarnation and mediumship stuff. But if you have specific questions about them, I'm happy to answer them. Thanks for listening.
Huge thanks there, Greg. Well, maybe we need to get you back for a second time so that you can do the mediumship, because I can't imagine people wouldn't be interested in that. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. I know I've got a few questions, but has anybody? Yeah, Stephanie's got one. So I'm going to say I'll open up to questions. Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you very much. That was truly interesting. And I think the question that comes up for me is, having done all of this research, found all of these stories across time, across religions, cultures, where have you got to in your thinking about what does this mean for us as humans existing in our lives now? Well, how does it relate to the nature of humanity?
I guess that it depends. I think it has to depend on whether these experiences are genuinely metaphysical experiences or whether they're just the special effects of a dying brain. But I think either way, because of the fact that people have this often have this kind of spiritual transformation and revive with this these positive transformations of being less materialistic and more charitable and kinder people. There's a great example, a materialist philosopher, A.J. Ayer, who didn't believe in anything like this, and then he had a near-death experience, and he came back and he said, I'm going to have to revise all of my books. I saw a divine being. And then his wife said later, he's been such a kinder person since he died. So it does seem like there's something about these experiences that genuinely does have a positive effect on people, which that in itself raises questions about, the objectivity of them, and what they actually mean. Like, even if you look at it from a purely evolutionary standpoint, why would coming near death turn us into better people? It doesn't really make sense from a super materialistic standpoint, as far as I can tell. So I know it's a really long-winded way of saying I don't really know, but I think if they are genuine experiences, then really it's the same type of argument, because whether they are or not, the positive transformation, I think, is a good indication of who we should be as human beings on this earth, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
If that doesn't answer,
thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a putting people on the spot there, Stephanie.
Sorry.
Question.
No,
That's absolutely fine.
I'm just trying to straddle both sides of the argument as well. So
No, that's great. Well, we've got another question. I'm really sorry. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. Is it Savinainen? Do you want to explain what your name is? I'm so sorry.
Just call me Antti. That's easier, I suppose.
Easier. That's fantastic.
Okay.
Over to you.
Thanks. So I'd like to ask about life reviews. You mentioned that in other cultures beyond Western cultures, there are not so many life reviews. Or are there any? Do we find any examples of life reviews which would correspond to what we've gathered here in the Western countries?
there are what I might call symbolic life reviews, like analogous experience. So there's a Native American example. I can't remember who or what culture at this moment, but this guy has an afterlife, near-death experience, and he goes to the afterlife realm, and he goes into a room where there's a man sitting at a desk, which seems to be probably a white colonial person. But on the wall, he sees a photograph, and that photograph somehow symbolizes his entire life, the guy having the near-death experience. So in a way, that's a life review. He doesn't go into the details, like his feelings about that it was panoramic, or that he experienced other people's emotions at the same time. That specific thing about experiencing other people's emotions, I don't think I've run across anywhere other than in contemporary Western examples. And the panoramic life review, it really is almost absent. It's really like the example of Pilgrim, as they reviewed, they went through his life's deeds, but there was nothing sort of panoramic about that. There's an interesting ancient Egyptian text that mentions that the soul of the deceased life played before him in an hour, which his entire life plays out in an hour, which that could be a reference to a life review, but it's not within a near-death context. It's just within an afterlife ritual context. So,
thanks.
Yeah, and whether
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just thought that in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, they are counting pebbles, black pebbles and white pebbles, corresponding to good and bad deeds. But that's about the only thing which I found about the life review. Do you have any other information?
No, I think that's, as far as I know, that's that would be the best equivalent in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. But I guess the big question is whether these things are fundamentally different, whether they're fundamentally the same, and they're just expressed differently in different cultures because of cultural symbolism limitations, or whether they are genuinely different experiences. But just the fact that they're thematically similar, that it's still an evaluation of one's life on Earth, in a way, that's the kind of super significant thing.
Thank you. If I saw you in person, I would ask you to sign this book.
Oh, thanks. Virtually sign it.
Thank you. Can I ask one quick question, and then we probably ought to wrap it up, because obviously time's getting on. Can I go back to your ancient religions? And you were talking, what the people that you were talking about who were having these near-death experiences seem to be people of quite a high social status. And I'm wondering if if that sort of, it almost allowed them to show they could conquer death in some way, or add to their status, that they were having these near-death experiences. I know obviously I'm being very generalized here, but I wondered what your view was on that, and whether, particularly with the ancient religions, whether it, having a near-death experience, gave you some extra status in your social circle, or was particularly something that was limited to people of a particular high social status, so it sort of gave them an extra power that they wouldn't, that normal people didn't have access to.
Yeah, I think that's probably really accurate. There are quite a few in ancient China that are they're kind of like small local provincial rulers. Some of them are just ordinary people, so it's a little more diverse there. But and it's also, of course, the the whatever accident of survival of these texts. There could have been more, as far as we know, but it's true, most of them did happen to the elites. And even in the small scale societies, indigenous societies, having an NDE gave them a different kind of status. It was almost like the shamanic initiation. And in fact, I think sometimes, especially in Australia, they obviously were having NDEs because people have them all around the world. But I wonder in Australia if they just interpreted them as a shamanic experience, and the fact of the context of it being near death or not was not really relevant to them. But I think people became shamans by virtue of an NDE. That's certainly the case in some of the Native American examples.
No, it's absolutely amazing, fascinating presentation, and amazing work that you're doing. So yeah, I can highly recommend people to buy the books. For those of you who know me, I'm particularly interested in the indigenous religions, but that's because that's where my bag is. Thank you so much. Yeah, just it's been fantastic to have you talk. So I'm going to close down the recording, so just bear with me a second. Let's stop the recording.
Thank you, Tina.